as there are people in attendance. So no matter the reason, I want to thank you for joining us and respectfully being part of this conversation, and likely this being the first of future ones to come. As we know, in June, the Supreme Court of the United States, in the case of Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, ruled in favor of returning abortion decisions to state legislatures. This ended federal constitutional protection for abortion that had previously been in existence for the past 50 years as it overturned Roe v. Wade. I am relieved to be providing reproductive health care in the state of Massachusetts. Our state, in fact, is protecting rights, and not just protecting, but further augmenting. And I think you'll hear from Kate Eschke later that this is like a moment by moment change as further protections are going into place. I am proud to be the chair of OB/GYN here, where we remain committed to providing high quality, evidence-based, safe reproductive health care for all of our patients across all of their reproductive health needs. And we remain committed to educating the current and next generations of clinicians to provide comprehensive health care, including the full spectrum of reproductive health care. And this, of course, includes abortion. It's an essential healthcare service. This is what we currently do, and we will continue to do. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Marlena Duncan, who will moderate the panel.
Thank you, Dr. Morsimas, for those insightful opening remarks and setting the stage for today's panel discussion. I'd like to welcome and thank everyone for joining us today. I'm Marlena Duncan, Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion and the Chief Diversity Officer for UMass Chan Medical School. The decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization has rocked both the legal and medical fields due to its broad implications. Today will be the first of many discussions that we will host centered around these implications, what we can do to support patients, physicians, and colleagues, and how we can work together towards reproductive justice as we navigate the uncertainty in this space. Today, I am joined by an incredible panel who will be speaking from both their personal and professional experience. So I'd like to start with each panelist just introducing themselves and sharing with us how this decision has impacted you both personally and professionally. And we'll start with Dr. Ireland.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Dr. Lou Ireland. My pronouns are she, hers. I am a generalist OB/GYN here at UMass Memorial and a complex family planning specialist. I've been providing abortion care for the last 12 years. I am also first generation. My mother's from Mexico, my father's from Vietnam, and this informs my perspective in providing reproductive health care. I'm also the parent to a 9-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy, and it is my mission and life's goal to provide the kind of care that I want them to receive, and work towards the kind of world that I want them to live in. The last month since the Dobbs decision has been very, very difficult. While I am grateful to live in the state of Massachusetts and practice in the state of Massachusetts, I am aware that the reproductive rights here, while we have fought vigorously for them, are not 100% guaranteed. And I very much feel the pain and suffering of my patients and colleagues nationwide. And I look forward to sharing a little bit more about that with you later in the program.
Thank you so much. Next, let's move to Dr. Garrison.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Garrison. I am also a general OB/GYN who is from Massachusetts and has lived here her whole life. I trained here through this system. I went to undergrad at UMass Amherst, medical school here at UMass, and stayed on for residency and as an attending. I have been providing full spectrum OB/GYN care to the women of Worcester County for the last 12 years as an attending. Which includes abortion care. I also am working as the Associate Dean for Student Affairs at UMass Chan Medical School. And so one of the focuses of mine is ensuring that our students get adequate education And I would say that advising and counseling students since this decision has come down has been one of the things that has been most impactful for me, and thinking about how does it impact the students that I'm advising and ensuring that they will be able to receive the training that they want to receive. In addition, I am the mom to a 6-year-old girl, and thinking about how this decision might impact her future life is something that has been kind of weighing on my mind pretty heavily over the last month.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garrison, for that. Next, Dr. Kumarswamy.
Hello, my name is Dr. Tara Kumarswamy. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist and I'm an abortion provider. I have been in practice for 16 years and I am the residency program director here at UMass. So like many people here, I had the privilege of going to medical school here at UMass, and then I went on to train in residency at our program here. During residency, I learned about the fellowship in complex family planning and knew that was something I wanted to do. I felt it was very difficult for me when we had to send our patients away instead of offering them the care that they needed. On a personal level, for me, I really want to ensure that I am able to provide a full spectrum reproductive health care and ensure that my patients are well cared for, as well as educating residents and students. So after the Dobbs decision came down, I was devastated. I was at Planned Parenthood and I continued to provide abortions, but it was incredibly difficult. It continues to be quite challenging, and I am the mother of 2 wonderful daughters who are almost 6 and just turned 9. And afterwards, one of them asked me if they were going to be forced to carry a pregnancy that they didn't want. I don't want that to be their future, and we're lucky here in Massachusetts, but I am so worried for my patients across the country who no longer have access to this essential healthcare. I worry about my colleagues who spent their whole careers learning these skills and honing those skills to be able to provide compassionate care to their patients. So I know that we're going to continue to advocate, and I appreciate people being here and willing to learn and just share with each other. So thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Attorney Eschke.
Thank you. My name is Kate Eschke. I'm Senior Vice President and General Counsel for the clinical system. And it's a true privilege to be on this panel with my colleagues. The Dobbs decision is deeply troubling to me, both personally as a woman and as the mother of 2 young adults, and professionally as an attorney who has been practicing health law for almost 30 years. The implications of the decision's radical departure from established precedent and constitutional principles that have been the bedrock of fundamental civil rights and the court majority's extreme form of originalism are frankly frightening. I am concerned not only for the rights to bodily autonomy for pregnant people, but also for all of us who look to the Constitution for protection of our basic civil rights.
So Attorney Eschke, we're going to stay with you. And if you can just briefly describe the decision in Dobbs and its broad ramifications from a legal aspect. What does it mean?
Absolutely. In the interest of time, I'm going to be extremely brief in this overview and apologize for all the details and nuances that are missed as a result. In the 1973 Roe case, the Supreme Court invalidated a Texas law that criminalized procuring an abortion except to save the life of the mother, ruling, among other things, that the right of privacy found in the First, Fourth, Fifth, Ninth, and 14th Amendments concept of personal liberty encompassed a woman's decision whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. The court found that the state's interest in potential fetal life was not compelling until fetal viability. The 1992 Casey decision reaffirmed that the due process clause of the 14th Amendment promises a, quote, realm of personal liberty where the state may not enter, and recognized the fundamental right to privacy as inclusive of the freedom to make, quote, intimate and personal choices that are central to personal dignity and autonomy. In Chief Justice Roberts' own words in his concurrence in Dobbs, the Roe-Casey line of cases, quote, recognized a constitutionally protected interest in making certain kinds of important decisions free from government compulsion. The Dobbs case overruled Roe and Casey, holding that the Constitution does not confer or protect a pregnant person's right to obtain an abortion, thus allowing states to regulate abortions unlimited by the previously recognized federal constitutional limits. The Dobbs Court majority rejected the prior court's holding that the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment encompasses a right to abortion on the grounds that the Constitution makes no reference to abortion and that the right to abortion is not, quote, deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions, nor a, quote, essential component of ordered liberty. The Dobbs majority goes on to state that state regulation of abortion is entitled to a strong presumption of validity, including any regulation rationally related to legitimate state interests, which they define as including respect and preservation of prenatal life at all stages of development. Specifically, with respect to the case actually before it, the Supreme Court upheld Mississippi's prohibition on abortions after 15 weeks gestation, given the state's asserted interest in protecting the life of the unborn. The ramifications of Dobbs are far-reaching. First and foremost, for access to reproductive care and the rights and options of pregnant people. We are seeing access to abortion services extremely restricted, completely banned, and even criminalized in approximately half of our states. There has been an immediate exponential increase in barriers to care. The obstacles which already existed for low-income people, minors, and those living in areas with limited access have increased. To quote the Dobbs dissent, above all others, women lacking financial resources will suffer from today's decision. As we will discuss on this panel, the Dobbs case creates legal uncertainty and risk for providers, patients, and people who may become pregnant across the country. Furthermore, the Dobbs case could have significant ramifications for civil rights in general. The 14th Amendment substantive due process line of cases, which included Roe and Casey, also includes Griswold and Eisenstadt, which protect the right to access to contraception for both married and non-married persons. Loving, interracial marriage. Turner, the right to marry while in prison. Obergefell, marriage equality. Lawrence v. Texas, right to engage in private consensual sexual activity with persons other than of the opposite sex, and Skinner, the right not to be sterilized without consent. The radical originalism of, if it is not explicitly provided for in the Constitution and is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions, then it is not a recognized right, could be far-reaching. Both the majority opinion and Kavanaugh's concurrence go out of their way to emphasize the specificity of abortion and the fact that the Dobbs case will not impact these other substantive due process cases. However, as observed by both the dissent and Thomas's concurrence, these assurances provide cold comfort, as nothing in the majority's reasoning is distinguishable or would prevent similar challenges to the court's precedents regarding contraception, marriage, sexual intimacy, and even for the purposes of today's conversation, the right to travel, which also is not referenced in the Constitution.
Thank you. So that is a lot to take in and to contextualize, but I do want to shift it to the clinicians. And what does this look like in the spaces that you are working? What are some of the concerns you've heard from patients and colleagues in relationship to this decision? And I'll open that up to any of the clinicians on the panel.
I can take the first stab at that. I think that and I think we could spend a whole hour just talking about that alone, so I will try and be brief. I think the feelings that patients and providers have in Massachusetts is clearly very different than what I'm hearing from my colleagues nationwide. When it comes to patients that we're caring for here in Massachusetts, we're hearing a lot of gratitude. Folks are so grateful that they can get the care that they need without interference from the law here. And I think, abortion patients are some of the most lovely patients that I take care of. And I take care of prenatal patients, gynecology patients, the whole gamut of OBGYN. But I think that gratitude has accelerated as people realize that the rights they have here in the state are not the same as folks who happen to live in different zip codes in different states than they do. We have started to see a slow trickle of folks from Texas. I have taken care of 2 patients from Texas. One was a young woman in a new relationship who just simply wasn't ready to parent. And she had family in Massachusetts and was able to come back here for care. And then the other was a lovely couple who was very excited about their first pregnancy until they had their anatomic survey, which showed that the baby had multiple abnormalities that was going to lead to a life of suffering if the baby survived the pregnancy at all. And they made a decision out of love for their baby, and that was to terminate the pregnancy. And unfortunately, they could not get the care they needed in Texas, so they came here, where they had family, and we were able to provide the care that they needed. I do want to underscore that these patients were fortunate in the sense that they had the resources and the privilege to be able to travel across the country and take the time out of their respective jobs and get housing to get this care. And the vast majority of people living in these states do not have access to those. And when we think about who these bans are going to affect the most, it's going to be folks from marginalized communities. So, Black and Brown people are going to be heavily affected. Patients who are immigrants, patients who identify as being part of the LGBTQ community, folks who are struggling to make ends meet. So the ability to travel, like Kate had mentioned, really is not a universal one. When it comes to our colleagues, again, our providers here are very grateful to be able to practice and provide care based on patient values and what is and our medical expertise without having to consider legal implications. There is a real concern about how we're going to accommodate all of the volume from states that are hostile to abortion. We know that the need to travel means that folks are going to be coming over at more advanced gestational ages. And while we have a number of people in Massachusetts who are comfortable providing first trimester abortion, that number really shrinks when we think about second trimester abortion. So thinking about the increased volume to be able to provide care at advanced gestational ages is something that's definitely on our minds. When it comes to our colleagues, the family planning community is a very tight-knit community. We do this work out of a deep love and compassion for the patients we provide care for. And it's this commitment that bonds us together as a community. Now, so that even as an abortion provider in Massachusetts, I am feeling the pain and frustration and overwhelm of my colleagues practicing in Texas, Ohio, Indiana, Florida, and other states that are hostile to abortion. What I'm hearing from folks is that turning patients away is really, really hard. It's really hard when you have the skills and the knowledge to care for the person in front of you, and you're not legally able to do so. Folks are having to choose between their obligation to the patient and their physical and mental well-being and medical ethics, and the other need to be safe from a legal standpoint and protect their medical license. And that's not a decision any physician should have to make. I'm also hearing from colleagues that are neighboring hostile states, like in places like New Mexico. And I think one of our former residents is on the webinar. These providers are just inundated with cases. Their caseloads have doubled, and time that they used to spend with their families or their personal lives no longer exists because they are trying so hard to take care of patients who desperately need this abortion care. So again, I feel very privileged to practice here, but I want to recognize what a hard time it is for colleagues who are practicing in other states. Drs. Kumaraswamy and Garrison, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I know I've seen patients, really an increase in the number of patients asking for sterilization because they have such concerns that if they were to unexpectedly get pregnant, that they would not be able to access the care that they might choose. So the number of people coming in asking for bilateral tubal ligations has gone up, seeing several each week. And then additionally, people who know that their IUD is good for, say, 5, 7, 10 years, they're afraid that the laws might have changed, that contraception might be impacted. And so they are asking to change them out earlier than even evidence suggests because they're worried about how that could be construed in the future. And just concerns about ability to access contraception, emergency contraception, things like that is on front of mind of many of our patients.
I've had similar things where I've had several patients come in who potentially know that they're going to make a move in the next several years and know that that might be to a place that is not as supportive of access. And so are making decisions about their contraception now because of where they might be in the future, which are decisions they may not have otherwise made. And then as I think about that, I think about how those are people who have the ability to plan and have the ability to think about that. And I'm sure I have a large percentage of patients that just don't have that ability, and thinking about the communities and the women that are not going to be able to understand what the implications might be and where they might be in the future, and how that is disproportionately, again, affecting the same group of people that Dr. Ireland spoke about earlier.
How is this going to impact our trainees? So uterine evacuation, whether through surgery or medication, is an important part of reproductive health care. And it's not only an essential part of abortion care, but is also a necessary part of miscarriage management. Can you tell us what current training our school offers to learners related to abortion and miscarriage management, and how this change may impact our and other training programs?
Thank you, Marlena. So I'm really grateful to some wonderful advocates who are on this call right now for Medical Students for Choice, who have been really bringing this to the forefront. So to ensure that here at UMass, we're able to teach about abortion, teach about miscarriage, and really expand our curriculum to provide the full spectrum of reproductive health care. And so I applaud their motivation and aptitude at this, and I'm excited that we're going to be ensuring that that is a really good part of the educational experience here at UMass. Through Medical Students for Choice, we've been doing the papaya workshop, which some of you may have heard about. We literally use a papaya as a uterus and practice first trimester manual vacuum aspirations on that. We teach about medication abortion. Our students that come through either LPPs or throughout their 3rd and 4th year have the opportunity to be with us in clinic, where we see our patients preoperatively for miscarriage or abortion, and then come to the operating room with us. So I think this is an essential part of their training as medical students, and we are really grateful that we can share this with them. I think it's really a wonderful experience for our patients to be able to see a patient who presents for any reason in our clinic, and the ability to talk about the different options that exist, whether it's parenting, adoption, or abortion, and see how we're able to ensure that we are focused on our patient's need. And the discussion is between the physician and the patient, and we're there to support them as they make the best decision for themselves. And then being able to see the relief that some patients feel after they are able to go to the operating room or take the medication that they need, or get the support in continuing their pregnancy. And so I am really grateful that as a teaching institution that we have our students with us, and that our residents in OBGYN often choose our program because we're a Ryan program, which means that we are focused to ensure that our residents get training in abortion, miscarriage, early pregnancy loss, contraception. Unfortunately, across the country, about half of our Ryan programs are not going to be able to provide abortions anymore. And so across our community, we're trying to figure out what is the best way to ensure education for those residents who obviously were interested in that, and that's why they chose those programs. So while we are very lucky here in Massachusetts that our state is continuing to provide abortion, that we're working to really strengthen the laws that support patients, providers, and whatnot in Massachusetts, we do have a responsibility to ensure that those in our surrounding community, and as Dr. Ireland said, we're a very close-knit community, that we can ensure that they receive education when they want to, that they have the ability to go out to provide. This is something that can be learned through simulation, like I said, with the Papaya workshop, but really that ability to provide care for many patients over time is how people learn those skills. And it's, I think, really important, really, like you mentioned, these are the same skills that we use for miscarriage and abortion. And so without these skills that we have really spent, years of researching, education, training, patients would not get the care that they need, whether it's an abortion or a miscarriage. And I think that sometimes gets lost in this discussion, that without this care, patients would also not be cared for properly when they are experiencing a miscarriage. Dr. Garrison or Ireland, anything to add? Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Garrison, did you want to talk about the training, or did you want me to talk about competitiveness?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. I think that, I touched on this in my introduction, which is, one of my focuses is on medical student education. And one of my favorite parts of my job is trying to, ask students where they want to go and try to get them to that end goal. And particularly when you're trying to help a student get to a residency program in OBGYN that's going to allow them to get the training that they need to provide the services they want to provide when they complete their training. I think a lot of our students are contemplating right now which programs are going to be able to provide me with that, and how are the programs that exist in the states that are hostile to abortion going to be able to train their residents to provide the care. And I think that, when I hear from my colleagues across the nation, they really are trying to find ways to provide this education for their trainees. And so it's not that I'm telling all students to not apply to programs in those areas. It just becomes so much more challenging. It's another thing. It's really, really hard to be a student. It's hard to try to match to an OBGYN residency program, and it's even harder to think about this on top of it. And so it certainly has impacted the way our learners are thinking about where they could do their training, and it has impacted our programs. And I feel for our counterparts in other states and trying to figure out how they're going to provide that to their learners.
Thank you. Several of you have mentioned marginalized communities and how they are disproportionately impacted by this decision. Love to expand that conversation, maybe get Attorney Eschke's viewpoint as well. What will that look like around equitable care for marginalized communities? How will this decision impact these groups?
Kate, do you want to go first?
Go ahead, Dr. Ireland, and I'll jump in.
Okay. So I think part of it I alluded to before. I think the most obvious thing is that folks from marginalized communities are going to be less likely to be able to travel out of state to get the care that they need, which means that they are going to be more likely to be forced to continue pregnancies against their wishes. And I think it's really important to understand what the impact is of an abortion denied. And this has been really well studied. We know that folks who wanted an abortion that did not get an abortion are much less likely to be employed. They're much less likely to leave violent relationships. They're much more likely to experience depression. They're more likely to rely on public assistance. So these are lifelong impacts that not only affect them, but trickle down through generations. So when we talk about equity, abortion bans do so many things to perpetuate inequity, not just for this pregnant person, but for her children and the generations that follow. I think the other thing to consider is the idea of self-managed abortion. And self-managed abortion has existed since the beginning of time. And we are, way beyond the generation where we talk about coat hangers. Like that doesn't exist anymore. The vast majority of self-managed abortion is done appropriately with mifepristone and misoprostol, and can largely be done safely, although it makes us feel better when patients come to the medical community to get that care. The reason why I bring that up is, no matter how safe abortion is, there's always going to be the few people who need emergency care. And when we think of folks in abortion hostile states who manage their own abortions, who need emergency care, they enter an area where now they are making themselves vulnerable to criminal prosecution. And we have already seen this happen in Texas. We have long histories knowing that criminalization has a lot of structural inequity built into it. So we know that Black and brown people are much more likely to be prosecuted than white people. And this is going to be the same when it comes to self-managed abortion. So that's another place where we really have to think about our marginalized communities and how inequity can be exacerbated by these abortion bans.
I have very little to add to Dr. Ireland's brilliant comments, other than many of the financial barriers to access predate Dobbs, and Dobbs only intensifies and exponentially worsens those financial barriers. To the examples that Dr. Ireland gave at the very beginning around who will have access to travel interstate to receive the services, it requires access to financial resources, childcare if you have existing children, the ability to leave work, all of those kinds of things. And in addition, there are going to be additional financial barriers as increasingly employers that are headquartered in states with bans or prohibitions may drop coverage for these critical services from their insurance plans. So I think it's really just an exponential intensification of existing barriers and the addition of new ones. The other piece to remember is that pregnancy and childbirth are not risk-free. Obviously, I return to my experts on this panel, and if you look at maternal mortality rates and the disproportionately high mortality experienced by Black African-American women in this country, the lack of access to the full range of reproductive health care, emergency contraception, abortion, could only worsen those already devastatingly horrific numbers. So, but I turn to my clinical expert colleagues to flesh those issues out.
Kate, thank you so much for highlighting the issue of maternal mortality and morbidity. One of the things that I am hearing from colleagues in states that are hostile to abortion is that there are a number of patients who are coming to labor and delivery, having broken their water at 17, 18, 19 weeks. And we know that these patients, that those pregnancies will not end up being normal pregnancies. The response that people are getting when they get to the hospital is, we cannot take care of you. You need to go to Illinois, or you need to go to New Mexico, or you need to go to New York. So it's not just that folks are being turned away and having to continue pregnancies. It's that folks are being turned away and not being able to travel to get life-saving care. These folks who cannot travel in the second trimester after breaking their water are at risk for life-threatening hemorrhage and life-threatening infection. So just to underscore what Kate said, this is really going to exacerbate the maternity mortality crisis.
Just to expand slightly on that, this is affecting people with ectopic pregnancies. So we all know that people who have ectopic pregnancies, there are multiple different treatments, some medication, some surgery. But in some of these states, they're being forced to wait until their ectopic ruptures, which is one of the #1 leading cause of maternal mortality in the first trimester. Until that happens, they feel that their hands are tied. And this is a direct ramification of Dobbs. So people are being forced to be on the brink of hemorrhaging to death. And I think our numbers are going to just keep going up for maternal mortality at this point. And those with the least amount of resources are going to have the hardest time accessing hospitals and physicians who are going to be able to help them.
The other question that has been flagged by many is that there could be regulation of pregnant persons' access to care unrelated to abortion services. They may, a patient who has cancer, but the treatment could have significant impact on a fetus, including potential death of the fetus. Whether that pregnant person's access to those potentially life-saving treatments could also be restricted or limited. And enough questions being raised about that, which again, when you take into account the financial barriers to accessing to interstate travel to access life-saving care, that could also worsen existing health disparities across the spectrum, not only in maternal care.
Hey, can you talk about, are there any legal implications for patients seeking care in Massachusetts?
It really depends on the state of residence, right? If the patient is a Massachusetts resident, as others on the panel have said, we're extremely fortunate to be living and practicing in this state. The immediate impact is really going to be around access because of the pressure on capacity from out-of-state patients, and also just the confusion, misinformation, and intimidation that is arising around the Dobbs case and its aftermath. If the patient is a resident of a state where abortion services or medical care that could result in the death of a fetus is restricted or illegal or even criminalized, it's a very complicated and somewhat open question that's all entangled in the conflicts of laws between different states and between the states and the federal government. So it's been mentioned already, sort of this complexity around medication abortions, whereas the FDA, the federal government, has said it's safe to administer mifepristone without in-person visits, which would enable telehealth. 19 states require in-person service. That's a question as to whether the federal law should preempt the state law. There'll be much litigation around that. If the patient comes from a banned state to Massachusetts and receives a first dose here, but completes the course in their home state, the home state could take, if it's a banned state, could take the position the abortion took place in the home state, and could, to date, there's not prosecution of the people actually receiving the care, but they could seek to reach people involved in arranging for or providing those services. For that reason, we understand, for example, Montana's Planned Parenthood is no longer providing medication abortions for patients from banned states. So currently, no state has yet enacted or sought to seek extraterritorial cross-border reach of their local laws, restricting or criminalizing receipt or provision of these types of services. However, there is precedent in the law for something called the effects doctrine, which essentially means that the home state, the banned state, could take the position or take an action based on the theory that the effects of an abortion completely provided in a state such as Massachusetts, actually the effects impact the state, and so thus they have a basis for an action. Fortunately, and I think we'll probably discuss later in the panel, that the Massachusetts is taking steps to try and protect our providers and others involved in such situations. And just on a call this morning, the head of the Civil Rights Division at the Mass Attorney General's office noted that the purpose of many of these laws and actions coming out of the banned states is precisely to intimidate and prevent access. So it's important for all of us to keep the risks in perspective as we evaluate those situations.
Can I add to that? I do want to say that the Massachusetts legislature, as a result of so much on the ground advocacy here, has been very, very proactive at trying to protect both abortion providers and patients seeking abortion care from out of state. So yesterday, the Massachusetts legislature passed a comprehensive patient and provider protection bill that would prevent us from complying with any subpoenas or any requests of health information from hostile states trying to prove that a patient came here for abortion services. So one concrete action step that we'll talk about at the end of the program is really putting pressure on Governor Baker to sign that, because that's the only thing holding these protections up from becoming Massachusetts law. But once that becomes state law, we will be able to do a much better job at keeping patients safe when they come from out of state to access abortion care here in Massachusetts.
So yes, let's talk about that. What role can local activism play in the future of reproductive rights? What are some things that we can do as a community? You know, we just mentioned one of them. Are there other things that folks have talked about within their professional communities?
Tara, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go? Okay, sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot.
I'm also, I can go, that's fine. I think looking at one really important thing is voting and ensuring that the candidates that you are supporting reproductive rights. And that is something that we really need to motivate people to do, because the vast majority of people in the United States support abortion. And so if we can get people out to vote, then hopefully we can really change the political landscape and ensure that people are protected and supported in accessing all healthcare.
Just to piggyback on that, I think when we talk about voting, people are so focused on the big elections, the national elections, but it's even these tiny elections, voting for your selectmen, voting for school board, those things count. Because when we're talking about all these senators and representatives, that's where they start. So we really want to make sure that everybody who enters a political spectrum is going to protect reproductive rights. I would also say consider, and this is more high-hanging fruit, but as part of your political or part of your careers and your future, think about running for office, even if it's something locally. Like, we don't have enough physicians that are helping to shape the laws which govern how we practice medicine. I would say more low-hanging fruit, get involved locally, get involved in your local ACOG, your Massachusetts Medical Society, whatever medical society that you're a part of, because you really do help shape how the state responds to issues surrounding how we provide healthcare. I have been amazed since I've gotten involved in ACOG and Massachusetts Medical Society of how much we've been able in the last 6 years to shape abortion law in Massachusetts, and how much physician voices really matter in the legislative field. I will also say a very, very simple thing you can do is take a stand when something is not right. This is not just an OB/GYN issue alone. Every specialty will care for a pregnant person at some point. And we've got to recognize, even if abortion isn't the thing that you're passionate about, this Dobbs decision sets a precedent for legislative interference. It sets a precedent that the government can govern how you practice healthcare and how you provide, how you make medical decisions for the patient in front of you. Many of you will not stay in Massachusetts, so I think it's really important to think about how you can be an advocate for your patients when you leave the state and continue providing healthcare. Just with respect to standing up when something's not right, I think that what happened this week at University of Michigan's white coat ceremony was really, really a beautiful thing. We think a lot about professionalism in medical school. Professionalism, remember, is doing what is right to honor your medical responsibilities to your colleagues and your patients. It is not following the rules, because sometimes the rules are not fair, and they perpetuate inequity and they perpetuate harm. So even something as simple as what happened at the white coat ceremony of University of Massachusetts is a way that you can use your voice and your privilege to try and shape and redirect the system.
Do you mind sharing with us what happened at the white coat ceremony?
Yeah, so at the white coat ceremony, the guest of honor was Kristen Collier, who is a University of Michigan faculty and, honestly has done a lot of really good work and it brought a lot of humanism to medicine. However, she is also a vocal anti-choice activist. And the medical student body, the incoming class, felt like, especially this year with the pullback on abortion access nationwide, it was really a poor choice to have her as a speaker. So at the white coat ceremony, when she came up to speak, 60 out of 160 students walked out. And it sent a very powerful message, not just to the medical school, but nationwide.
And if I could just very briefly jump on what Dr. Ireland said about the potential reach beyond abortion services to other forms of healthcare, that's actually recognized in the bill that's going up to the governor here in Massachusetts, because it protects not only providers of abortion services, but also providers in Massachusetts of gender affirming care, which is another area where we've seen very aggressive regulation of medical practice, the provision of medically necessary care.
I just wanted to share that, and I think many people know this on this call, but abortion is safer than childbirth. Abortion is safer than a colonoscopy. And so where else is it that politicians get to make decisions about healthcare? And as we're talking, we are seeing that it might extend beyond where we're at right now, but this is a safe procedure that really can be life-saving. And so just to keep that in mind, that this is, essential healthcare for people and very safe healthcare for people.
Okay, so we have several questions in the chat. I know we will not get to all of them, but we are going to try to get to as many as we can. We also will be following up with an email for those that registered with some of the answers to the questions that have been posed in the chat. So I'm going to start with the first question. Would the panelists agree that a Supreme Court's originalist approach to legal interpretation and application in decisions is counter to medical innovation and advancements? Is there concern this may further impact other medical decisions and care?
I would say yes. The extreme originalism of if it wasn't contemplated by the drafters, if it's not deeply rooted in what the court's version of the nation's history and traditions are, that then it is not protected by the Constitution, absolutely has application beyond abortion, most immediately in the arenas of contraception, sterilization, and other forms of healthcare that those who drafted the document, the Constitution, did not contemplate. So yes, I would say there's a significant, there's nothing in the majority's opinion that would prevent that from being the case.
So could the panel share the unintentional consequences of this ruling for patients who are struggling with infertility and or rely on services related to diagnosis and treatment for cancer?
And looking at infertility specifically, many folks might choose to use, in vitro fertilization. And then the idea in some of these states is that at conception is when abortion occurs. And so this can lead to many issues for these couples who are choosing to get pregnant through in vitro fertilization, where oftentimes there is a creation of multiple embryos. And so what is going to happen with the embryos that are not utilized at that time? Are they going to be prosecuted for abortion if they don't utilize all their embryos? There are many questions that I don't think everyone has, including the politicians, thought through. And so this is going to have wide-ranging implications across the board. Kate, you had something to add?
No, I completely agree. And practitioners in the area of reproductive endocrinology, assisted reproduction are raising exactly those questions. Many of the states, Utah included, have such broad definitions, as you say, that go to the point of fertilization, not even implantation, raising questions about the use of IUDs, let alone emergency contraception, and in the area of IVF, exactly as you say, what rights will these states endow a fertilized embryo with? Does it mean that reproductive health clinics, IVF clinics cannot create embryos, that they have to keep the eggs, they have to keep it separate until the moment of creation of an embryo that will actually be implanted, so that they don't have something that has legal rights under state law sitting in their freezer, to be blunt. So those are significant concerns. And to the other question, absolutely questions are being raised about the use of medications, other forms of treatment for cancer and other conditions that could have an impact on the fetus or the viability of a fetus, and whether those will be swept in under these laws as prohibited.
I think the tough thing with all of these situations is there are so many different medical diagnoses, so many different medical conditions that affect pregnancy, that it is not possible for a law to account for every single one of these scenarios or every single one of these exceptions. And that's where the idea of legislative interference is really problematic in the practice of medicine. I think we've really got to move towards a society where we trust doctors to make ethical decisions based on their oaths and their medical training to provide the right kind of care, because the body is unpredictable and there's just no way we can predict every situation in which someone will need abortion care.
I see Dr. Morsimus has rejoined us, so I know you had some comments as well.
Well, I was just saying, with regards to the question in infertility, I know that SART, which is the Society of Assisted Reproductive Technology, is very actively reviewing all of the consents as it relates to assisted reproductive technologies, of which there are many, in the context of the Dobbs decision, and trying to, respond to that. Most assisted reproductive technology services offerings, use SART as the baseline and foundation of their consent forms. But even thinking about what Dr. Kumaraswamy said, as far as, freezing gametes as opposed to embryos, we actually know that success rates for pregnancy are higher with a frozen embryo transfer instead of a fresh embryo transfer. And so there are, a lot of reasons behind that, but also even if sort of you get to the point of transfer, you're potentially affecting success rates.
Apologize, I'm navigating through all the questions. Okay. There was a question about student concerns and reproductive health rights. So your thoughts on supporting student concerns on reproductive health rights?
I guess it'd be helpful to know, it'd be helpful to know which concerns there are. And I know that there are many, many, many. I will say that the students here at UMass have been fantastic about advocating to supplement their education, to make sure that they're getting good education on reproductive health care, both through the OBGYN interest group and through Medical Students for Choice. But if there's like a specific concern that you want us to talk about, it wouldn't be helpful to clarify.
Marlene, was this specifically about the students in Michigan walking out and the concern for retaliation? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. I think as part of education, it's important that everyone is able to use their voice in whatever side they're on. And so people should be able to speak their minds and without fear of retaliation. I think that is a very difficult thing for the hierarchical area of medicine to do. And so I think it's admirable when people speak up, and there needs to be a way to ensure that students are supported and not fearing retaliation, which I think is difficult, and residents as well.
I would also say that there's power in numbers. And, when you have 60 people walking out, you're not going to have 60 people being retaliated against. But I also want to be really clear that, speaking up and doing the right thing does not make you immune to consequences. And that's why doing the right thing is hard. And it doesn't mean that it's not the right thing to do. But if you think of all the big change makers, there have been consequences, good ones and bad ones. And I think that we need to not fear those consequences if we really want to change the system.
How can we get more men involved in reinforcing that this is not a women's issue or pregnant person issue?
I think we want everyone to support access to bodily autonomy. And I don't have a great answer for that, but I do think it's a good question.
Yeah, I think that the reproductive rights movement and the reproductive justice movement welcome the involvement of people of all genders. How we get folks without a uterus motivated to participate. Pregnancy takes more than someone with a uterus, and even men are going to be. I think that we need to think about the women and the pregnant people, or the people who can get pregnant in their lives, and think about the kind of care that we want them to receive. No one ever expects to have an abortion, but it can be a very life-saving and validating thing. It can be a very necessary thing for somebody's health and livelihood. And if we think about all the folks in our lives, we want to make sure that the people we love have access to everything. I don't have a good answer, but I think it's really important to involve everybody.
So we are at 12:58, and I do want to leave some time for closing remarks. I just want to really thank all of the panelists. This has been so informative and so helpful, I know to me, but I'm sure to the rest of the UMass and UMass Memorial community. So I'm going to now turn it over to Crystal Roberts, who will give some closing remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan and all the panelists. Again, my name is Crystal Roberts Gilbert, and I serve as the inaugural director of the UMass Memorial Health System's Office for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. On behalf of our Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Brian K. Gibbs, and Dr. Eric Dixon, President and CEO of UMass Memorial Health, it really has been an honor to work in collaboration with the UMass Chan Medical School's Diversity and Inclusion Office, as well as with their Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, to host this important panel discussion. Because although not enough, we know engaging in dialogue in a multidisciplinary organization is an important first step. We also understand that this issue is complicated and has historically been incredibly polarizing, and that there are different voices that have differing opinions. But we still want to affirm and reaffirm that UMass Memorial Health's priority remains the care of our patients. Accordingly, we will continue to provide the services and patient care we have always provided. Also, given that we are a safety net hospital, we will continue to work to understand our ability to provide abortion and other reproductive services for patients who come from out of state, where abortions are either illegal or criminalized. And as well, we'll continue to educate the current and next generation of clinicians to provide comprehensive reproductive health care. On behalf of all the hosts and co-sponsors, thank you to all of our amazing panelists and engaged guests for attending what we hope will not be the last of this important conversation. Please enjoy the remainder of your day.
Thank you, everyone.